Welcome to our deep dive into Factfulness,
Yeah.
a book that really challenges us to see the world more clearly.
Uh,
And we're going to unpack some of the most common misconceptions about global trends
okay.
and really how our instincts can actually lead us astray.
It's really fascinating, this book.
Yeah.
What's really interesting is that it's written by Hans Rosling,
Yeah.
a doctor and a global health professor
Mhm.
who spent his entire life just fighting ignorance.
Right.
And he doesn't just tell us what's wrong with our worldview. He
Yeah.
shows us
Yeah.
using all these compelling stories
Yeah.
and hard data.
Yep. And it's interesting.
He starts off with a pretty unexpected story
Yeah.
about his childhood dream
Oh.
of becoming a sword swallower.
Okay. Have you ever had a dream that seemed totally out of reach?
Right.
Well, young Hans was convinced he could do it.
He was so convinced, in fact, that he tried to swallow a fishing rod.
Oh, wow.
I mean, you can imagine how well that went.
Yeah, I'm cringing just thinking about it.
Yeah.
But years later, as a trainee doctor,
Yes.
he meets the actual sword swallower
He does.
from an x-ray that he had seen in
Yeah.
medical school.
Talk about a chance encounter.
What a random encounter.
I know. And the sword swallower
Yeah.
reveals a crucial piece of information that Rosling was totally missing.
Oh, yeah.
The throat is flat. You can't... Yeah, only flat objects can slide down.
Interesting.
Now, you might be thinking,
Yeah.
what does this have to do with global trends?
Yeah, it does seem like a pretty random story.
Right.
But Rosling uses this to illustrate this idea of data illusions.
Uh-huh.
These preconceived notions that we have
Yes.
that can actually blind us
That's right.
to the truth.
Just like Rosling was so sure he could swallow that fishing rod,
Yeah.
we often cling to outdated worldviews, even when we're presented with evidence to the contrary.
So we need to challenge our assumptions, basically.
Yes. And this brings us to one of the most shocking discoveries in the book. Most people score worse than chimpanzees
Seriously.
on basic factual questions about global trends.
Worse than chimpanzees. Okay, I need to hear more about this.
So Rosling would ask people
Yeah.
simple questions like,
Yeah.
what percentage of the world's children
Okay.
are vaccinated today?
Okay.
Most people would get these questions wrong
Really?
consistently,
Wow.
choosing the most negative or dramatic answer, even when the data clearly showed otherwise.
Wow.
It's as if we have this inherent bias towards negativity.
So it's not just that we don't know the facts.
Yeah,
It's that our instincts
it's our instinct.
are leading us astray.
That's right.
We see the world as much worse than it actually is.
Exactly.
Right.
And this really challenged Rosling's initial belief
Uh-huh.
that ignorance was simply an upgrade problem.
Okay.
He thought that people just needed updated information,
Right.
but he realized that something more fundamental was at play.
Okay.
Something he calls the overdramatic worldview.
So what exactly is the overdramatic worldview?
It's that human tendency to
Exactly.
see the world as more frightening, violent,
Come-
and hopeless than it actually is.
Okay.
And it's not entirely our fault.
Okay.
These instincts, these fears and anxieties
Uh-huh.
were once essential for survival.
Right.
But now in a world that is actually safer than ever before,
Yeah.
they can distort our perception.
Yeah. That makes sense.
They make us overestimate threats
Okay.
and underestimate progress.
So our brains are basically wired
Yeah.
to focus on the negative.
Yeah.
But how do we break free from this negativity bias? How do we
Exactly.
start seeing the world more accurately?
That's where factfulness comes in.
Okay.
Rosling gives us this set of tools,
Yeah.
this framework for thinking
Okay.
that can help us overcome these distorting instincts.
Okay.
And one of the most important tools
Yeah.
is his concept of the 4 levels of income.
Okay. I've heard about this. It's a way of understanding global development that moves beyond those kind of simplistic
Yes.
developed versus developing categories, right?
Exactly.
Instead of just 2 categories.
Yeah.
Rosling divides the world into 4 levels based on income,
Right.
each representing a different stage of progress
Mm.
and access to resources.
Can you give us a quick rundown
Yeah.
of what each level looks like?
Yeah, I think it would help to have a concrete image in mind.
Absolutely. So on level 1,
Okay.
you have about 1 billion people living in extreme poverty,
Wow.
struggling to survive on less than $2 a day.
Okay.
They're walking miles for water, cooking over open fires, and
No.
facing just immense challenges.
Yeah.
But then you move to level 2,
Okay.
where 3 billion people have access to things like bicycles, electricity, and some basic health care.
Okay.
Their lives are still difficult,
Yeah.
but they have more opportunities.
Well, yeah.
And then on level 3, another 2 billion people enjoy life that's more similar to what you might be familiar with. They have motorcycles, refrigerators, running water, and even some access to higher education.
Okay.
And finally, on level 4, we have the wealthiest 1 billion people with access to all the comforts and conveniences of modern life.
So what's the point of dividing the world this way?
Right.
How does it help us to be more factful?
It helps us to see that the majority of the world's population now falls somewhere in between those extremes of poverty and wealth.
Okay.
We're not in a world of us versus them anymore.
Right.
It's a world of gradual progress with most people clustered in the middle.
It's like we need to update our mental map of the world.
Exactly.
Right.
And another tool that can help us update that map
Okay.
is something Rosling calls the social thermometer.
Oh, okay.
He uses child mortality rates
Okay.
as a way to measure the overall health of a society.
That's an interesting analogy.
Yeah.
How does that work?
Well, think about it. Child mortality rates reflect so much more than just health care. They're an indicator of food security, sanitation,
Right.
access to clean water education levels,
Okay.
and overall societal well-being.
Right.
A high child mortality rate is like a fever,
Yes.
signaling that something is wrong.
Yeah.
But as a society develops,
Yeah.
as those basic needs are met,
Right.
child mortality rates plummet.
Right.
It's like the fever breaking.
So by looking at child mortality rates, we can get a sense of how much progress a country has made.
Precisely.
Right.
And Rosling uses this heartbreaking but ultimately hopeful anecdote
Yeah.
about his time as a doctor in Mozambique
Uh-huh.
to illustrate this point.
This is where he had to make those incredibly difficult decisions
Yes.
about allocating limited resources.
Yes. He had to prioritize preventative care for the many
Right.
over expensive treatment for the few,
Yeah.
even though it felt counterintuitive
Right.
to turn away from a dying child in front of him.
Yeah, I can't even imagine.
Yeah.
It forced him to look at the bigger picture,
Yeah.
at the overall health of the community,
Yeah.
rather than just focusing on these individual cases.
And that brings us to another major misconception
Yeah.
that Rosling tackles,
Yes.
the gap instinct.
The gap instinct.
This is that human tendency to divide the world into
Yeah.
two distinct groups.
Yeah.
Us and them,
Right.
rich and poor, and
Yeah.
so on.
Uh-huh.
But as Rosling shows with the data,
Yeah.
this is just not an accurate reflection of reality.
Most of the world doesn't fit neatly
Right.
into these extreme categories.
Yeah.
In fact, Rosling asks,
Yeah.
what percentage of the world population lives in low-income countries?
Mm.
Most people guess way too high,
Okay.
the actual answer.
Yeah.
Only 9%.
Wow.
Significantly lower than most people would imagine.
So the gap between rich and poor isn't as wide as we think it is.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's why it's so important to be aware of this gap instinct.
Yeah. To recognize how it can distort our perception of the world.
It's like we're constantly looking for those divides, those differences,
Yes.
when in reality, there's a lot more overlap and interconnectedness than we realize.
Exactly. And this is just the beginning.
Okay.
Rosling goes on to explore several other instincts that can distort our worldview.
So let's keep unpacking these instincts.
Yeah.
What's the next one on the list?
Let's do it.
Okay. All right. So we've talked about the gap instinct. What other mental traps do we need to watch out for?
Well, you know how sometimes it feels like the world is just going downhill?
Yeah.
That all we hear about are problems and crises?
Yeah.
That's the negativity instinct in action.
Okay.
We tend to focus on the bad and overlook the good,
Yeah.
even when there's plenty of good happening.
I think we're all guilty of that sometimes.
Yeah.
You turn on the news and it's just like this constant barrage of negativity.
Right.
It can be hard to stay optimistic.
Exactly. And it's not that those problems aren't real.
Right.
It's that our brains are wired
Yeah.
to pay more attention to threats.
Right?
Think about it way back in the day.
Yeah.
Our ancestors who focused on dangers were more likely to survive.
Right.
Those who were overly optimistic about that saber-toothed tiger lurking in the bushes,
Yeah.
they probably didn't pass on their genes.
Right. So we've inherited this negativity bias.
Yeah.
Even though the world is objectively safer than it used to be.
Right. But here's the thing.
Yeah.
while we're fixated on the negative, amazing progress is happening all around us,
Okay.
did you know that extreme poverty has been cut in half in the last few decades?
Wow.
Or that child mortality rates have plummeted?
That's incredible.
These are incredible achievements, yet they rarely make headlines.
It's like there's this secret, silent miracle of human progress happening.
Yeah.
But we're too busy doom scrolling to notice.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the big global trends.
Really?
Think about your own life. Have there been times when you've focused on the negative and overlooked the positive?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
I'm a master at catastrophizing.
Okay.
But recognizing that negativity bias is a good first step towards overcoming it, right?
Absolutely. And that brings us to another instinct. Rosling discusses the straight line instinct.
It's a straight line instinct.
It's that tendency to assume that trends will continue in a straight line, often leading to some pretty inaccurate predictions.
So instead of straight lines, what kind of patterns should we be looking for?
Rosling talks about different curve shapes. S-bends, slides, humps, each representing a different kind of trend. He uses the example of population growth. Many people assume it will just keep increasing,
Right.
but that's not actually what the data shows.
Okay.
Have you ever heard of the fill-up effect?
The fill-up effect. I don't think so.
Well, imagine a bathtub filling with water.
Okay.
At first, the water level rises quickly, but as the tub gets closer to full, the rate of increase slows down.
Okay.
The same thing is happening with population growth.
Okay.
Due to factors like declining child mortality and increased access to education, the rate of population growth is slowing down.
Interesting.
We're actually approaching what's called peak child.
Peak child. What does that mean?
It means the number of children in the world is stabilizing. Right. And as those children grow up and have fewer children themselves, the overall population growth will eventually level off.
So instead of picturing a line shooting straight up, we need to imagine more of an S-curve with the growth eventually flattening out.
Exactly. And that's just one example. How recognizing different curve shapes can help us make more accurate predictions and avoid unnecessary panic.
Okay. Straight lines, check. What's the next instinct we need to be wary of?
The fear instinct.
The fear instinct.
It makes us overestimate the likelihood of unlikely dangers, especially those that are vivid and easily imaginable.
Oh, like plane crashes, terrorist attacks, or natural disasters.
Exactly.
I admit those things definitely play on my fears sometimes.
And that's how the fear instinct works. It hijacks our rational thinking and makes us focus on those dramatic events, even though they are statistically rare.
So what can we do to overcome this fear instinct? How do we stop ourselves from spiraling into anxiety every time we see a scary headline?
Rosling has some really practical advice. He says we need to calculate the risks. He encourages us to look at the actual data on things like plane crashes, terrorist attacks, and natural disasters. The numbers are often surprising. For example, deaths from natural disasters have actually decreased dramatically over the past century.
Wow, I didn't know that. I guess it makes sense. We've gotten better at predicting and preparing for those kinds of events.
Right, but because those positive trends don't trigger our fear instinct. They don't hear about them as much.
Right, it's like a negativity filter on the news.
It is.
Yeah. So instead of letting our fears dictate our perceptions, we need to step back and look at the bigger picture.
Exactly. And that brings us to the size instinct.
The size instinct.
It's the tendency to be misled by the size of individual numbers without considering the context or the overall trends.
Can you give us an example?
Sure.
I'm not sure I fully grasped this one.
Imagine you see a headline that says 1,000 people died in a natural disaster. That number 1,000 seems huge and scary. But if you compare it to the global population, it's actually a very small percentage.
So it's not about denying the tragedy of those deaths. It's about putting them into perspective.
Exactly. Rosling says we need to compare and divide. When we see a large number, we need to ask, compared to what?
What's the overall trend?
Right.
Is this an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern?
This reminds me of that anecdote Rosling shares about his time as a doctor in Mozambique, where he had to prioritize preventative care for the many over expensive treatment for the few. It was a difficult decision, but it ultimately saved more lives.
That's a perfect example.
Yeah.
Rosling had to look beyond the individual cases,
Yeah.
the heartbreaking stories of those he couldn't save,
Right.
and focus on the bigger picture.
Right.
He had to think about the overall health of the community.
So the size instinct, like the other instincts we've discussed, can distort our perception and lead us to make decisions based on emotion rather than facts.
Right. And that's why it's so important to be aware of these instincts, to question our assumptions, and to always look for the bigger picture.
Okay, I'm starting to see how these instincts all connect together. They're like these mental shortcuts.
That can lead us down the wrong path if we're not careful.
That's a great way to think about it.
Yeah.
They're heuristics, mental shortcuts that helped our ancestors survive.
Right.
But in today's world, they can often lead to distorted thinking.
So what's the next instinct on our list?
Okay.
I'm eager to keep unpacking these and learn how to overcome them. So we've been talking about all these instincts that can, like, warp our understanding of the world.
Like the negativity instinct and the size instinct?
Right, and how those can lead us to focus on the wrong things or misinterpret data.
Right.
But there are a few more we haven't covered yet.
There are a few more.
Okay, so what's next on the list of instincts we need to be aware of?
Let's talk about the generalization instinct.
So the generalization instinct.
Yeah.
What's that all about?
Well, it's that natural human tendency to categorize and generalize.
Okay.
Think about it. We do it all the time.
Right.
We group things together based on shared characteristics.
Yeah.
It helps us make sense of the world.
Right, like we categorize fruits and vegetables or types of music. It makes things easier to understand.
Right.
Yeah.
But when it comes to understanding people and cultures, this instinct can lead us astray.
Yeah.
We might start making assumptions about entire groups based on limited experience or stereotypes.
Like assuming everyone from a certain country is the same.
Right.
Or that all members of a particular group share the same beliefs.
Right. And that's where the generalization instinct can be dangerous.
Yeah.
It can lead to prejudice, discrimination, and missed opportunities for connection.
Rosling tells this kind of funny story about this, right?
He does.
Something about refusing to eat giant palm nut tree larvae.
Yeah. He was visiting a village in Congo and was offered this plate of, let's just say, unique delicacies.
Okay.
And he was desperately trying to find a polite way to refuse without offending his hosts.
So what did he do?
He came up with this brilliant excuse. He said, you see, we don't eat larvae.
Okay.
And then the villagers pointed out that his companion was happily munching away on these larvae. And Rosling just claimed that his friend was from a different tribe.
That's hilarious.
I know.
He used the generalization instinct to his advantage?
He did. And while it's a funny story, it highlights a serious point.
Right.
We need to be aware of our tendency to generalize.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to people and cultures.
So how can we counter this instinct?
Okay.
How do we avoid making those sweeping judgments?
Rosling gives some great advice here.
Okay.
He says we should look for differences within groups and similarities across groups.
Right.
Just because one person from a certain background behaves a certain way doesn't mean everyone from that background is the same.
It's like remembering that everyone is an individual.
Yes.
Regardless of their group affiliations.
Exactly. We also need to be wary of the majority.
Okay.
Even if a majority of a group exhibits a certain trait, there will always be exceptions.
Right. And we should be careful about generalizing from one group to another.
Yes.
Just because something is true for one group doesn't mean it's true for all groups.
That's right. It's all about challenging our assumptions, looking for the nuances, and embracing the diversity of human experience.
Okay, so we've tackled the generalization instinct.
Okay.
What's next?
Let's talk about the destiny instinct.
The destiny instinct.
Yeah, this is that tendency to assume that things will stay the way they are, overlooking the power of gradual change.
It's like that saying, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Exactly. But the reality is that the world is in constant flux.
Right.
Things are always changing.
Yeah.
Even if those changes are slow and subtle.
Rosling uses this encounter he had with Nkosazana Dlamini Zimba, a South African politician, to kind of illustrate this point, right?
Yes. She challenged his assumption that progress in Africa would be slow and incremental, pointing out the rapid advancements that were already happening.
Oh, wow.
She showed him data on the significant improvements in areas like child mortality, education, and access to basic necessities in many African countries.
It's like he was stuck in this outdated mental model of Africa.
Yeah.
And she helped him to see things more clearly.
Exactly. And this happens to all of us.
Right.
We get attached to our familiar narratives, our comfortable assumptions about how the world works.
Yeah.
But we need to be willing to update those narratives as the world changes.
So how do we counter this destiny instinct?
Okay.
How do we stay open to the possibility of change?
Rosling says we need to keep track of gradual improvements.
Okay.
Even small incremental changes can add up to huge transformations over time.
Right.
He also reminds us to update our knowledge.
Yeah.
The world is constantly evolving, and our understanding of it needs to evolve as well.
So it's about being willing to learn to question our assumptions.
Yes.
And to embrace the possibility of a better future.
Exactly. Now, the next instinct we'll discuss is closely related to this.
Right.
The single perspective instinct.
Single perspective instinct.
It's that tendency to get stuck in one way of thinking.
Yeah.
Limiting our ability to see the bigger picture.
So it's like having tunnel vision.
Right.
Only seeing things from our own limited point of view.
We might be so attached to our particular ideology, our political beliefs, or our cultural background that we fail to consider other perspectives or acknowledge the complexity of issues.
Rosling uses his experience in Cuba to illustrate this.
Yes.
He saw both the successes and the limitations of Cuba's healthcare system.
Right.
Recognizing that even systems he might disagree with can have valuable insights or achieve positive outcomes.
That's a great example.
Yeah.
He was able to step outside his own ideological framework and see things from a different perspective.
So how do we avoid falling into this trap of single perspective thinking?
Rosling encourages us to consider multiple perspectives and use data to inform our decisions. He also emphasizes the importance of humility, recognizing that we don't have all the answers and being willing to learn from others.
That makes sense. It's about being open-minded, curious, and willing to challenge our own assumptions.
Right. And now let's move on to another instinct that can really derail our thinking.
Okay.
The blame instinct.
The blame instinct?
Yeah.
It seems like everyone is pointing fingers these days.
It's a natural human tendency to look for a scapegoat when things go wrong.
Right.
It's much easier to blame someone or something than it is to understand the complex interplay of factors that often contribute to problems.
Rosling tells that story about the student who suggested punching Novartis in the face.
He does.
To change the company's research priorities.
Yes, that story is both funny and insightful.
Yeah.
It shows how the blame instinct can prevent us from finding real solutions.
We get so focused on finding someone to blame that we miss the bigger picture.
Exactly. Rosling encourages us to look for systems, not heroes. Instead of attributing everything to the actions of individuals, we need to understand the complex interplay of factors that contribute to events.
So instead of asking who's to blame, we should be asking what are the underlying causes.
Exactly. And that brings us to our final instinct, the urgency instinct.
The urgency instinct.
It's that tendency to react to perceived threats with a sense of urgency.
Okay.
Often leading to rash decisions and missed opportunities.
It's like that feeling of we have to do something now.
Yes.
Without always carefully considering the consequences.
Rosling uses his experiences with roadblocks, both during the cholera outbreak in Mozambique and the Ebola crisis in Liberia, to illustrate this point.
Right. Those roadblocks were intended to stop the spread of disease.
Yeah.
But they actually had these unintended negative consequences.
They did.
They disrupted essential services, created panic, and eroded trust in authorities.
Exactly. And Rosling also discusses the dangers of exaggerating urgency.
Okay.
Especially in relation to climate change. Fear-mongering can actually backfire, leading to inaction or paralysis rather than meaningful solutions.
So how do we counter this urgency instinct?
Okay.
How do we find that balance between taking action and avoiding those knee-jerk reactions?
Rosling urges us to take a deep breath.
Okay.
Look at the data and make informed decisions.
Okay.
He also encourages us to be wary of those who preach urgency without offering concrete solutions.
It's about being thoughtful, deliberate.
Yes.
And avoiding those emotional appeals that can cloud our judgment.
Exactly. And with that, we've covered all 10 of the distorting instincts that Rosling outlines in Factfulness.
Wow.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it?
It has. We've explored these mental traps, these ingrained ways of thinking that can distort our view of the world.
Yeah.
But we've also learned how to overcome them.
Yes.
We've learned how to be more factful.
That's what Factfulness is all about.
Yeah.
It's about cultivating a worldview that is grounded in facts.
Right.
in data,
Yeah.
and in a realistic assessment of the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead.
It's not about being naively optimistic,
Right.
but about recognizing the progress we've made
Yes.
and the potential for further improvement.
Exactly. It's about embracing a sense of possibilism, as Rosling calls it.
I like that.
Yeah, that belief that things can get better, that progress is possible, and that we have the power to make a difference.
Factfulness is more than just a book.
It is.
It's a framework for thinking, a toolkit for making sense of the world.
Yeah.
And by applying these principles, by questioning our assumptions and embracing a more data-driven approach,
Yes.
we can not only make better decisions, but also live with less fear and stress.
We can become more informed citizens, more effective problem solvers, and ultimately more responsible stewards of our planet.
So to wrap things up, what's the key takeaway you hope our listeners will remember from this deep dive?
I think the most important message is that the world is actually much better than we tend to think. We've made incredible progress on a wide range of issues, from poverty to health to education.
Right.
But our instincts often prevent us from seeing that progress, leading to a skewed and overly negative view of the world.
Yeah.
By understanding those instincts, by recognizing how they can distort our perceptions, we can start to see the world more clearly.
Yeah.
We can become more informed, more rational, and ultimately more hopeful.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up this deep dive into factfulness.
But before we go, we want to leave you with a final thought.
It's okay.
What's one deeply held belief you have about the world?
Yeah.
And how would applying factfulness change your perspective?
That's a great question.
Yeah, it's something to ponder as you go about your day.
Yeah.
We encourage you to explore more of Hans Rosling's work, including his fantastic website, Gapminder, which is full of interactive data visualizations and tools for understanding global trends.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Yes.
We hope you found it insightful and inspiring.
And until next time, stay curious and stay factful.